Top of the morning, Dan, and in for Amy J. This morning, Charles Thomas, former ABC7 political reporter.
Good morning.
Charles, we talked last hour about the border, given the remarkable statement, I think, that KJP offered in defense of Biden's dithering on border security. Well, let's play that again, because this really needs to be memorialized in the minds of our listeners and shared.
Open the briefing by saying it's up to Republicans to do something to solve the problem or continue to use it as a political issue. The president has the authority to do something about this unilaterally. Congress is in a divided government right now. Why isn't he doing anything?
Well, why should he have to do it unilaterally? Why should we do it in a legislative way? And let's not forget that negotiated.
Undo some of.
Wait, so you're right. He took many executive actions before.
He's taken many executive actions before, and he has executive power here, and he's not going to exercise his executive power because apparently what's happening is what he wants.
He's getting killed on this one, and it's hard to believe that you have people in the White House, from the chief of staff on down to the other policymakers there, that she could actually come out and say something like that.
Yeah. Why should he take executive action? Why not do it legislatively? Well, because this is an emergency situation of his own making, and because he has primary and virtually plenary authority when it comes to, the executive does, when it comes to border security. So those are a couple of reasons. Some real world reasons, practical matters. Customs and Border Patrol, May 23rd, Del Rio Sector Border Patrol agents assigned to the Del Rio station conducted a traffic stop on a 2015 Ford Escape on Highway 90 East near Laughlin Air Force Base. One individual ran from the vehicle, jumping a fence and entering Laughlin Air Force Base. Agents later detained the individual, a 17-year-old Mexican male. The other four occupants of the vehicle, all adult males, suspected of being in the country illegally, also detained and transported to the Del Rio Border Patrol Station for processing. So I assume that means they're enjoying their stay in Texas or wherever else they'd like to be moved about the country. But so breaching military bases. So that was one, just as sort of the happenstance of an escape. But I mean, how does he enter Laughlin Air Force Base? And then this, a little bit more serious. A dozen House Republicans are demanding information from the government about two Middle Eastern men who tried to break into the Marine Corps base in Quantico using a box truck. One of the two Jordanian nationals involved had crossed the southern border illegally in San Diego back in April. Authorities found no initial derogatory information while screening him, so they let him go into the U.S. with a future court date to pursue asylum. Of course, asylum from Jordan? What exactly is the political persecution going on in that moderate Muslim nation? I'm not familiar.
So they were in a box truck. Was anything in the truck?
We don't know. This is sort of what House Republicans want to know. In a letter, they write, a brazen attempt to infiltrate a military installation by four nationals from a terror-prone region, because Jordanians are not, the Jordanian regime is not, rightly raises concern as to whether this constituted a possible terrorist attack, yet the federal government has not disclosed whether this breach was terror-related. Inquiring minds would like to know. Yeah.
And these guys are locked up now. They aren't... Or did they release them? I'm sorry if I...
The pair ignored instructions from officers, tried to drive onto the base where additional vehicle bearers were deployed to stop them. Well, that's good. The former Navy SEAL Robert O'Neill told the Post the breach showed signs that could indicate it was a possible dry run for Al-Qaeda or ISIS, see how far they can get a truck into a base. He said it looks like it was a test run for something else like truck bombs, because they tried to get in saying they were delivery drivers, then sped up as barricades popped up.
Whoa.
They were lucky they weren't shot. And I think now Brandon Johnson's paying their rent in Chicago. I think that's where they are now. No, we don't. I don't. It's not disclosed. I don't know. I assume they're in custody, or I assume they've been returned to Jordan. But
Oh yeah, good luck.
yeah, right. Well, exactly. These are assumptions we can't make anymore because we have a president who doesn't want to exercise the power he has in the interest of our national security. Why
Yeah.
should we do it? You do it. Real compelling. Wonderful, KJP. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Steve Cortes, who writes at stevecortes.substack. And Steve is also heading up this organization called the League of American Workers that we will discuss. Steve, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good morning, Charles and Dan. Thanks for
Good
having me.
morning.
So, a breathtaking statement from KJP, and that's saying something because she makes breathtaking statements all the time. But yeah, why should we do it? That they should do it.
Well, to your point, when you mentioned that the plenary powers of the president, this is, by statute, this is the one area where the president has practically king-like authority over the border. And I think a lot of Americans don't even necessarily realize this. He can shut the entire border down unilaterally by himself, by statute. He can also exclude any foreigner for any reason from coming into the United States. He doesn't even need to have a good reason to exclude a foreigner from entering into the United States. So he has sovereign king-like powers, and to your point, he is choosing to not exercise them, quite the opposite, because not only is he tolerating the chaos and the mass trespassing into America, but in fact incentivizing it and welcoming it. And let me give you one other aspect, because this might be instructive for the audience. I was just there at the U.S.-Mexico border. I filmed a short documentary, which is going to be out as soon as next week. So please be on the lookout for that. But I was down in Cochise County at the U.S.-Mexico border, which is south of Tucson. And one thing I was not aware of, an additional risk beyond sort of the obvious risks of an open border, is that the Mexican cartels are increasingly recruiting American teenagers. They reach them on social media. They're very sophisticated. They know how to get a hold of them on Snapchat. They know specifically how to target and geofence poor American kids in places like Tucson. They offer them a whole lot of money to effectively become drug mules or drivers more than anything else, and that is to drive both people and drugs from the border north into places like Tucson and Phoenix. The reason they recruit teenagers is because if they do get caught, they're treated as juveniles, and of course the criminal justice system isn't that harsh on them. But think of how frightening this is. The sheriff of Cochise County told me that they have arrested hundreds of minors, American minors, who are now children who are being recruited by the Mexican cartels. I mean, just think of that aspect alone. There's so many aspects that are just dangerous and reckless of an open border. But my gosh, that was a new one to me. I covered in the documentary, and I hope that concerns every parent in America that, oh my gosh, like my child, if I happen to live near the border, or not near the border for that matter, could be recruited by the Mexican cartels because of this open border situation that Biden has invited into America.
Well, sure. I mean, it's corrupting in ways that you can't imagine when you're talking about transnational criminal organizations that have the resources of these cartels.
Right.
So one is left to assume that if the president is sitting on his hands, then this is what he wants to see happen.
Right. And unfortunately, look, he does. And I think for two reasons. One is that the left, unfortunately, and we need to be realistic about this on the right, the left loves chaos. It invites chaos. That's the first thing. But then the second thing is they believe that if they win this election, which is entirely possible, I think Trump's going to win, but it's going to be close. They believe that if they win this election, they will then have the power to give full amnesty to these millions and millions of people that they've invited into the United States, unvetted and unfiltered, and that they will then have their votes for decades to come. So I think we need to be realistic about just how crass and cynical this play is from the left. Now, thankfully, the polling shows us that, that it doesn't work. And on my latest Substack, you mentioned I put on a lot of polling that my organization has done, League of American Workers, but also some public polling out there from news organizations like CBS News, which, as we know, is no friend, to the populist nationalist right. But they asked Arizonans, for example, getting back to Arizona, they said, is immigration making life better in Arizona? As recently as 4 years ago, about a third of Arizonans said yes. It was roughly third of it makes life worse, there's no impact, it makes life better. Well, now only 13%, and this is, again, CBS News polling, only 13% of Arizonans say that immigration is making life better in Arizona. I mean, think about that. A state that is historically as pro-immigrant and as intertwined with Mexico as any state in America has turned that severely, that intensely against immigration because they, unfortunately, it's a nationwide problem. Of course, it's a Chicago problem, as I know all too well. But they're at the front lines of this, quite literally, and dealing with a way that other states are not. And so my hope and my belief is this is part of why states like Arizona, which are going to be determinative in the election, are swinging pretty hard toward President Trump. That same CBS News poll showed Trump with a 5-point lead. My polling showed it with a 4-point lead. Now, that's nothing to get complacent about. That's nothing to be comfortable about. We needed to work for every vote. But the point is, President Trump is in a good position in most of these swing states, and a huge, huge driver of that lead. Those leads are this immigration crisis.
Well, speaking of polling, I wonder what your view is on this dynamic at present, where Biden has a Biden problem, but the Democrats don't have a Biden problem beyond Biden. And what I'm talking about is, of course, in states like Arizona, some of these swing states, where you have Democrat incumbent senators up, for example. You have Democrat senators holding leads, Pennsylvania, Arizona, slight lead, but a lead nonetheless. I mean, there's outside the margin of error difference between how the Democrat senator is performing versus how Biden is performing.
Correct.
And so what is it Republicans need to do? Because electing Trump and getting rid of Biden obviously would be material progress, but it will be severely blunted if it doesn't come with majorities in Congress.
Correct, and I'm seeing that in all the polling I'm doing, and most of the public polling is now validating that. Not only does Trump not have coattails in a lot of these Senate races, he seems to have reverse coattails. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of folks out there, and I think we just need to be honest about this. We've got the two men with the highest negative ratings in America running for president, right? Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Now, obviously, I don't feel that way about Donald Trump. Most of your audience doesn't. But the reality is these are two incredibly polarizing figures with extremely high negatives. So given that, a lot of people who are voting for President Trump, and I am seeing this in my polling, I've also seen it in some focus groups, which I think are important. A lot of people are voting for him. It's not because they like Trump or that they necessarily believe in Trump, but Biden is making their life exceedingly difficult. So they're willing to vote for Trump, even though they're not excited about it. They then, though, even this, sometimes I think it's subconscious, down ballot, they effectively balance their ticket. They then say, but I'm not going to vote for this sort of Trump acolyte. So my advice to these Senate candidates is don't run a pro-Trump campaign, run an anti-Biden campaign. Make sure that you are being your own candidate. Let Trump take care of Trump. And I believe he's going to win, and I'm doing everything I can to make that happen, personally and with my organization. But to these Senate and congressional candidates, particularly in swing states or in blue states who are fighting, I really believe that they need to run anti-Biden races that are independent of Trump, because I do believe that this reverse coattail effect is real, and it's probably going to persist into election day.
And is there anything else that Republicans need to be tackling that beyond, not just running as a Trump acolyte, to use your phrase, those Republican Senate and congressional candidates too? So up and down the ballot, gubernatorial candidates, up and down the ballot, what is the inhibitor for people who are saying this president is making my life difficult? Well, why? What is preventing us from getting over the top to say this president is just a company man for a party that is making your life difficult, and that's what you need to understand. But
correct.
But they don't.
I think I think you're exactly right that we need to message that better, right? And to be really specific, here's what I'm finding in my polling, which has frankly surprised me. Like, I knew Americans were extremely angry about inflation, right? But when we get down to the specifics, what makes them the most angry by far is food inflation, which is interesting because I would have guessed that it would be, mortgage costs or rent, because for most people, that's a much bigger expense than food. Now, they're mad about that, but they're way more angry about food. So, for example, that's a place to be super tangible. Like, okay, your grocery prices, you cringe at the cash register at the grocery. And if you happen to have a large family and you're a middle income person, you are getting crushed right now by this. I mean, this is just, they are in a deep recession, those folks, middle income people who have a lot of dependents, who have a lot of children. And let's make sure that they know that that is directly because of Joe Biden and his party and his acolytes, his acolytes. And some of them, too, look, here's the thing. They do a good job of pretending that they're moderates, and we need to unmask them. We need to show what radicals they actually are. John Tester is a perfect example of that in Montana. He doesn't fit Montana values at all, but he does a great job. He's got the crew cut, and he's chubby, and he wears jeans, and he's always on a tractor, and he does a great job of convincing Montanans that he's sort of one of them, even though he goes to Washington, D.C., and he votes like Nancy Pelosi. So we need to do, I think, a better job of revealing a lot of they just happen to have some pretty good candidates who are good at fooling people right now. Sherrod Brown in Ohio would be another example. Diego in Arizona, who's from Chicago, by the way, originally, another good example. He seems reasonable in Arizona, but his voting record in Washington, D.C. is way more like Rashida Tlaib than anything reasonable. So the more that can be communicated effectively between now and Election Day, the better shot these folks have. I do believe we're going to take the Senate. We know West Virginia is an automatic pickup, which means we only need one more. And if I had to bet on one at this point, I think I would bet that it is Montana, in fact, but we'll see. And look, all of them are going to be competitive. All of them are going to be close, and we've got a lot of work to do.
Steve, Charles Thomas here. What do polls say about other Democrats running against Donald Trump?
I'm sorry. What do you mean by other Democrats?
Well, I mean, if it's not Joe, have you done any polling on Gavin Newsom, for instance,
or Jared
or even Kamala or whatever?
J.B. Pritzker. Yeah.
Right. The only one that we have tested is Kamala, and the reason I did that, and by the way, she does even worse than Biden in our polling, and the reason I did that is I'm of the belief. Now, I could be wrong. But if Joe Biden is going to be replaced, and there's obviously a lot of chatter about that, I don't think that's happening, but let's just say it does. I believe, given the, quote, rules of the Democratic Party, the absurd rules that they have set up on the left, where they are obsessed with identitarian politics, I believe it's an impossibility for them to pass over the black woman who's number 2 in line. I don't think that can happen. So, again, maybe I'm wrong on that thesis, but that's all we've tested so far is Kamala Harris. And by the way, another thing we tested, which is pretty effective, is to remind people that they are, if you do vote for Biden, that you are effectively voting for Kamala regardless. Forget about him being replaced between now and Election Day. The point is, who believes that this man can last 5 more years, which is what it would be roughly from today until the end of his term? I don't think any reasonable person believes that he can last in that office for 5 more years. So if you vote for him, you are effectively voting, at least with a decent degree of probability, voting that at some point there will be a President Kamala Harris. And I hope that's frightening, even to people who might consider themselves to be sort of center-left.
What about trying to gauge the outcome of the Manhattan trial in terms of polling impact, electoral impact? Did you have any sense of if Trump is convicted of any of the crimes for which he is charged in Manhattan? Do you have any sense how that plays out, at least in the short term?
Yeah, we've been testing this quite a bit, and this is my biggest worry. Okay, look, I think Trump's going to win. Again, he's got a reasonably comfortable lead in most of these swing states. He has a huge commanding lead in some of the swing states, like Georgia. To me, the biggest risk is a guilty verdict, and not because there's any validity to this case. There's not. Of course, this is a kangaroo court. It's a sham. Of course, all of that. But what we are finding is that when we ask about the validity of these cases and whether or not the prosecutions are fair, are just, what we're finding is it breaks down almost entirely on party lines, unfortunately. And we were expecting better than that, quite frankly. And among independents, it tends to break against Donald Trump. And I think the reason, Dan and Charles, is I think there's still a lot of legacy bias in favor of the American legal system. A lot of Americans want to believe that we have a fair, reasonable, good, august legal system in this country, and they have a legacy bias because we used to, okay? And we did for a long, long time in the United States, but they've convinced themselves, and I think some of this is through pop culture even, TV shows, all the crime, true crime genre, they've convinced themselves that this legal system is still basically sound. And I don't believe that's reality at all, but regardless, that's where people are. And so because of that, once you can accurately call him a convicted felon, and again, we think it's absurd, of course, but once you can call him that accurately, it will matter. So to me, that is the biggest risk for Trump. I still think he wins with a guilty verdict, but I think, this Georgia plus 10 probably compresses. We probably go to Georgia plus 5 or 6 with a conviction there. Again, I think we're still going to win. But I think it makes our path a bit harder. And I think we need to be, again, honest about that way. And by the way, we're doing this polling. We're not push polling. We're not trying to get the answers we want. We're trying to find out, okay, where are people? And if they're not in the place we want, then how do we move them? What are the arguments to move them?
And these are likely independent voters, like that we're talking about, for example, that break slightly against Trump in the event of a guilty verdict.
That is exactly correct.
Yeah, that's an issue. I know. I've been saying it for a long time. It's an issue, and
it's going to matter once they can say convicted felon.
Yeah.
And they're going to say it a million times, right?
Yep.
And it is technically an accurate phrase at that point. Okay, as long as we think it is, it's going to matter. Again, I'm not trying to depress people out there. We're going to win this election. All right. Inflation and immigration are such massive issues, those two eyes, that I believe they're going to overcome the negatives of a conviction in New York. But don't ignore the problem that a guilty verdict will cause for Trump if it does in fact come down.
Steve Cortes, League of American Workers. You can get his writings at Steve Cortes, Cortes, stevecortes.substack.com. Steve, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Have a wonderful holiday weekend. Thank you.
You too. And Steve joined us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to podcasts of Dan and Amy from the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
Trouble with your sump pump? Call Permaseal 800-421-SEAL. With over 100 trucks on the road, we'll be there within 24 hours to troubleshoot or replace your pump. Hi, I'm Roy Spencer at Permaseal.